Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar today, where we will be talking about how we can leverage workplace surveys to drive L&D excellence. So today we're really talking about ways that you all, as L&D professionals, HR professionals, can take meaningful action. That's actually a word a lot of you used on engagement survey, performance data results, so that you can continue to foster employee growth and development. Let's introduce everybody who is here with us today. So starting off, I'm going to be moderating the discussion today. My name is Kaylin Cooney, and I am calling in from fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada. And I am here on behalf of Hone, where I serve as a learning strategist that is part of our L&D consulting arm of our organization. My background is in industrial organizational psychology, which is a fancy way of saying that I am a psychologist who studies humans at work. And I have also worked in the L&D space for the last 10 years, where I've worked to design, manage, facilitate, and evaluate a variety of learning and leadership programs across different audiences, across different industries. So really this panel today sits, I think, at a perfect junction of things that I'm really interested in, which is how do we translate the data that we have into real human results in our roles as L&D professionals. So very excited to be here alongside my fellow panelists, Paul and Ani. So Paul, I would love to pass the mic to you.
Sure. Thanks, Kaylin. Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Mastrangelo. I'm an organizational psychologist as well. Actually, I just met up with Kaylin last week for a big conference, so that was great. My work, I do predominantly what I would call employee-centric change. So using feedback, usually from surveys, but trying to figure out how do we make the most of that information. And I do that for my firm, which is First Domino Consulting. It's based in Rhode Island. Shout out to Rhode Island, biggest little state. But today I'm actually calling from a client that's based outside of Philadelphia, King of Prussia. So yeah, I guess that's about it. I'll pass it off to Ani.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for joining. My name is Ani Acker, and I lead the learning and leadership development function here at Celonis. Most probably no one has heard of Celonis, but I'll give you a little bit of background on our company. I actually joined Celonis about 2.5 years ago. We are an adult startup company, tech startup company, and Celonis is a platform that helps companies find inefficiencies in their business processes and actually recommends how fix that process, and then saves you a ton of money along the way and adds value to the organization. So very excited to be part of the organization, because when I was asked to come and lead the function, there was really not anything that existed. And so we had to build everything from the bottom up. And we're 2.5 years into our journey. We've done quite a bit of great work here. My background is mostly learning and leadership development. Both have been on the consulting end, so worked for big consulting companies, as well as leading learning and leadership development functions at Fortune 100 and 500 companies. And then finally being out on my own as, running my own practice in learning services. So I've been on all parts of the equation. I've been a vendor, have been a consultant, have been an employee. And so excited to share all of my insights with many of you, and even, hopefully maybe learn a couple of things along the way.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for being here as well. I'm very honored to be hosting this powerhouse panel as a member of Hone. I do see some familiar names in the attendee list, so welcome to everyone who is joining in our Hone community. And for those of you who are not familiar with Hone, we're really excited you're here. And we will also start off by just sharing a little bit about what we do. So Hone is really working to redefine learning. We have a next-gen platform that combines live virtual classes with expert coaches and cutting-edge program management technology to really offer both effective and, most importantly, scalable training in your organization. So we have the largest content library of its kind focused on power skills, and we're really designed to empower learning leaders to run live programs for all of their employee audiences under just one simple subscription. And I've heard people call it the Peloton of learning and development, which I think is kind of fun. We do have over 100 courses in our course catalog on some really critical skills, things like communication, collaboration, leadership, giving effective feedback. And the critical thing is that all of our classes are live and collaborative experiences. And that's because we believe that those power skills that are social skills need to be learned socially. So that is a little bit about us. The skin that we have in the game, why we're here, is because, of course, we believe in really excellent learning and development programs. And so let's talk a little bit about why this conversation is important to all of us. This is really why we're here, the things that we want to talk about. And so what I want to start with is some data on why this is important. So I think a lot of us are probably joining because we have maybe felt like our organizations could do more to boost engagement, but we're not sure where to start. And we're not alone in that. And the data here is going to show that. So in fact, a whopping 60% of employees feel the same. They don't really get what their organizations are doing to ramp up engagement. And it's not just about that understanding, it's also about action. So shockingly, or it was shocking to me at least, only a third of employees actually believe their organizations will do anything with the feedback that they provide. So we're collecting all of this data through surveys and people don't actually think it's going anywhere. And then the big kicker is that almost half of employees wish their organization would step up and address their feedback more effectively. So I think we all see that as a clear call to action that we as L&D providers, as people in our organizations, we can't really afford to ignore that. And so then how does that connect to L&D? This fits into the equation because employees who feel like they're missing out on L&D opportunities are twice as likely to leave your organizations. Twice as likely. That's huge. And what tops the list, and I think we saw this, seen this really historically in the last few years as the reasons that people are leaving is, you can probably guess, is lack of career growth and development. And it's the number one reason that's cited by over a third of employees who decide to move on from their organizations. So that's what's at stake. That's the role and responsibility that we all play as professionals in learning and development or the HR space. And so in this webinar, we're really going to dive into how we all can use engagement survey data, performance data to supercharge our L&D strategies so that they're more impactful. We're going to get into the nitty gritty. We're going to share some real world examples, and we're going to most importantly give you actionable tips that you can take back into your organization. You're excited to dive in. Yes, no more slides. We're just gonna chat today. So we're gonna jump right in, Paul and Ani, into some heavy hitting questions. The first one that I have for us today is, there is obviously an abundance of data from employee surveys, from performance data. So how do we actually prioritize which insights we should focus on to maximize our L&D strategies? I think data is numerous. And so where do we even start?
You want me to tackle it, Ani?
Go ahead. Why don't you start?
All right. Well, I'll tell you the same thing that I talk with clients about when they have an established survey. And part of that survey is measuring engagement. It seems to me that the first floor level action is, well, let's see what actually drives engagement. And I think that term, driving engagement, is maybe a little bit misunderstood. Think about it like this. There are some things that if you were asked questions on a survey for your employer, there are some things that you would answer, you'd be honest about it, but it really wasn't as important in terms of what energizes you, right? So the things that are most energizing you, and I'm in complete agreement with you, Kaylin, it's things that improve us and improve me. Right. So yes, I want to see, options for me to improve my skills and my career advancement opportunities. But also I want to see us be better. We want to be a part of a winning team. Right. So I think the idea of saying, wow, we're getting better and better at this, and I see my executive leaders doing things that makes us better and better. That's great. I'll give one quick sidebar. It could be that you're doing a great job. You have a highly engaged workforce. And in that case, what I would say is what you really want to do is you want to think about how you want to leverage all that energy. It's like fuel in the tank. It could go stale. So how do you want to leverage that? And to me, the best way, it's going back to your question, is, well, think about the metrics that matter most to the organization's performance. Maybe it's your customers, maybe it's innovation, maybe it's efficiency. So whatever the answer is, say, okay, let's talk with the employees and say, how can we do this? And let me hear your ideas and let's follow something through. So I've unpacked a lot, but that's sort of a generic way I would answer.
No, and I love that. And I think that's a good point about when we have really high engagement survey results. Sometimes, well, where do we go from here? There's nowhere to go up, but it doesn't mean that we don't continue to action on the data that we're receiving. Ani, anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, sure. I think, from my perspective, and Paul, you've touched on this, I don't start with the kind of the where I want to look at and what data is available. Before I even get to that, I want to understand what my business strategy is. And then how do we kind of align to what we're going to do in order for us to drive that strategy, right? Because people are driving that strategy for the business, right? Whether, like you said, whether it's revenue, whether it's customer health, whatever we're focused on, and then kind of, take a step down from there to start to understand what are going to be the key indicators that are going to help us identify whether we've been successful or not. And then you kind of take a step back and think, okay, what are all the different data points that are available to me? So when you think about data and, whether it's engagement scores, whether it is any other type of data that you're looking across the organization, you look at it from two different perspectives. You can think about what's data I can collect, right? That can actually help me connect these dots together. And that can be relevant to help us figure out, if we're making an impact or not, and prioritizing, because, there's so much data out there, right? And then, what might be the most relevant organizational data that exists, whether it's engagement survey, whether it might be, even talent reviews that you can, connect to, with your talent and performance colleagues in the organization who have, insight into more individual data, not necessarily organizational. So you have to kind of balance, how you use that data, because, it can become very overwhelming. But, if you set a very clear listing strategy up front and think about, what are going to be the key things that you will look for, and start small, and really prioritize on the key things that are going to be the most relevant. Because it really, honestly, I mean, we work in a company at Celonis where data is king. We're all about process intelligence, and data is a key part of that. And we can get lost in all of the data that might be available to us. What is important is, kind of start small, be pragmatic about it, and be practical, and think how you connect the dots on the meaningful stuff. And then you can prioritize that way.
Yeah, so hearing from both of you that it's even just taking a step back, right? Let's make sure we're aligned on the business importance, the strategy, so that we know what those indicators are that are most important to where we are as a business right now. And then I love, Ani, what you said about starting small with what you can move the needle on. I think sometimes too, we think we have to solve all of everything that comes up on our engagement survey, but not everything that comes up has a training solution, for example, right? So let's think about where we can have an impact, and not try to eat everything all at once, as the saying goes.
I look at engagement surveys as an input, right? It's not the only measure, right, of employee, whether it's performance or, other things. So it's just a point in time. You have to use it with the kind of grain of salt.
Yeah.
But understand how you can, what are the key things that you want to take from the engagement survey that really speak to your strategy?
Absolutely. Wonderful. And so then our next question, in your opinions, what are some of the biggest, and I think this ties into kind of what you were saying, Ani, at the end there, is what are some of the common pitfalls that organizations face when they're trying to implement changes based on the survey data that they have coming in? And more importantly, maybe how can they overcome them? So pitfalls, and how do we overcome?
Yeah. Go ahead, Ani, you're on a roll.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. I think, again, boiling the ocean, right? We feel like we have to address every single, kind of engagement survey result. And that becomes our focus. Ultimately, the score itself is not the focus. What your focus should be is what is the underlying cause, and then getting to the root of those causes. And if you have the right listing strategy, you can tap into that to do a deeper dive. And not feel like you have to take all of that on, because it's not, the responsibility of L&D to fix engagement score surveys. Again, it's using the data to help inform how do we, kind of leverage that data to help us, kind of craft a new path or something new that we want to do for the organization. But a big pitfall I see is, by the way, when you do action planning around surveys, and depends on your organization's survey cycle, sometimes, by the time you actually start with action planning and have put action plans in place, it's time for the next survey. So, and that is a little bit of a case here at Celonis. So we're always running after it rather than kind of being ahead of it. So, try to be very practical. But from my perspective, we look at those as a point of data. Don't let that be the lead just use that for what it can give you. What is even more relevant in engagement survey, I'll add this, is more of the, not necessarily the data point, but I read a lot of the commentary from our employees. That tells a lot more when you look at engagement survey data rather than just looking at a score, because the score is, right, is a sentiment. But when you start to read what people are saying, that becomes even more real and you can action on that.
Yeah, and they tend to give you a little more information about like the importance or the urgency of some things, right? Versus we may inflate what a number means, but when you actually look at the qualitative information, it's, oh, that actually, we could push that down the road a little bit and that would be okay.
Exactly, because you can come up with a couple of themes that you can focus on. Yep.
Perfect.
Yeah, just quickly bouncing off of that, the danger in that is that sometimes a leader reads comments and they remember that one colorful comment, and you can imagine there are colorful ones, and that undoes what maybe hundreds or thousands of people were saying with the collected numbers. So you have to balance that out. I like to tell leaders, well, look at the numbers and identify what makes sense to you to take action on, but then use those comments to sort of get the extra seasoning, the extra background on what all that means. Let me go back to the question though. You were saying, what are some of the pitfalls and ways around it? So one of the reasons why I created First Domino Consulting is sort of that name, right? The idea of you need to do some things to actually leverage sort of all the other people in the organization, and that creates movement. So you got to arrange those dominoes and then be the first domino. To me, one of the things that's happening is a lot of times post-survey, the actions are one and done, right? So it's okay, I said I was going to do something, I did this, and now I'm done, and I'm clapping my hands and moving on. And of course, I think it's better to take a more iterative approach. Let's think about sort of the outcome I'd like to achieve, but let me involve my employees in terms of how we're going to get there. And maybe we start with something simple, like you said, Ani, right? Let's start with something simple and let's see how far that takes us. And then as we learn about what's working and what's not working, then we have a better sense of how to take action to make more of an impact. The other thing I would say is that I think we don't think about human beings, we don't think of employees as being the conduit of change. We think of them as the object of change. And I think fundamentally that's not quite right. So if we could think about, again, we say, all right, we're going to climb this mountain. That's the goal, but I don't know how. Well, maybe one of the first things we can do is we figure out who are some folks that employees would nominate to work with me as the leader to say, all right, yeah, you know what? I want Ani and I want Kaylin to work with Paul because, they really know their thing and they represent us. So now I'm hearing things from you, but you're hearing things directly from the folks who nominated you. I have a much more sense of what's going on. And from there, we can talk about creating some solutions. And now I'm working through all of you to have an impact on the folks that brought you there to this team, right? So that's just a short little example of what I mean. So we're leveraging the folks who are influential in the organization, and we're taking some of the things that are going on, what they've said from the survey, and then saying, all right, let's try some things. Let's see if we can make some motions. But involving folks, I think that's the number one thing, almost more important than what you work on. It's how you work on it. And I think that's what we've got to improve on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that relates a little bit to Zach. I saw put in a comment. Nearly every company I've worked for fails to share when changes that are happening as a result of the last survey. Do either of you have any kind of recommendations on best practices for transparency, communication, post-survey that you could share before we move on from this question?
Yeah.
Sure. Oh, go ahead, Ani.
Yeah, sorry, Paul. So we do reference, so, when we look at that engagement survey and we know that there's an action that we're taking, right? So we're looking at it from the perspective of what the learning and the leadership development team can do to support, right, that change that we can make. So we're not looking at it from I'm not manager looking at my team. So have a bit much more a different organizational view. So what we found is that when we connect back, and, when we start to tie what we're doing to specific things that we're trying to, drive in a gap that we found in an engagement survey, we will reference that. And we kind of reference a lot of our engagement data and where we see the opportunities to connect that. In addition to that, when we set goals throughout, at the beginning of the year, we oftentimes tie our KPIs to improving those engagement scores, like the programs that we will bring to help drive that. And those are shared across the organization. So there's a lot of transparency into what is expected of us and, what our goals are and what are we trying to impact.
Yeah, so just kind of that just open transparency of what's going on, what we found, what's going on. It sounded like you had some thoughts too.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and it's tough, right? Because transparency means you're vulnerable. And I think that's a good thing for leaders, right? I think we respect leaders who are vulnerable, but let's face it, it's difficult. All eyes are on you and you don't want to mess up. So I think part of that is the mindset of the leader to say, okay, I know what we need to accomplish. I've heard what you've told me. I like the feedback. Thank you for that. And some of that feedback, to be honest with you, I agree with. You know what? We got to do better. And some of it's on me, some of it's on our systems, and maybe some of it's on all of us, right? So the idea of saying, okay, how can we sort of be open about that? So to me, like I said, just a quick repeat, I like a leader who says, we're going to go to the moon at the end of the decade and bring that person back, or a Volvo, right? We're going to, by the end of this particular year, we're going to strive for no fatalities in our cars. These were bold goals, but the idea was to involve the employees in how we're going to get there. One more practical idea for you to think about. Many of you do many of you do pulse surveys where you ask the same questions that maybe are from a bigger survey and you do it more often. I would say turn that into a progress pulse where you think about, okay, if we want to take action on something, what do I expect the employees to see in 3 months? What will be visible to the employees in 3 months? And I'm going to ask them, are you seeing this? And of course, they're not. Well, that means we're not doing a good job and we've got to progress, right? And try to making this action. And if they are, great. Now what comes next? What's the next wave? Like maybe they had a conversation with their supervisor, but maybe they haven't set goals yet on how the department supports the larger initiative, things like that. So you're always checking the progress. It does give feedback to the leaders about what's working and what's not, but it's also completely transparent. We said we were working on this. These are some things that we're striving for. How are we doing so far? So it is possible to integrate all that.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of responsibility and a lot of vulnerability, like you said, but can create some connections for people and more visibility in terms of the movement that's happening. I also had an interesting question come into the Q&A that I think is related to this idea of communication and transparency, and stepping back further, even just how do we frame our surveys? So the question is, there's an ongoing issue where we're trying to create credibility and honesty when soliciting feedback, but we hear of situations where there's a disclaimer that all feedback is anonymous, but then it isn't all that confidential when it comes down to it. So are these anecdotes actually common practice? Why would companies breach this? Are we kind of blowing this, kind of issue or fear out of proportion in your experiences? Would love to hear your experience with this.
From the survey vendor point of view, certainly if I'm the firm that's creating the survey and the survey experience, believe me, I don't want to create any problems for you. I don't want to breach the confidence of your employees, because obviously that's bad business for me. And oh, by the way, it's just the wrong thing to do, right? So for all sorts of reasons. However, there are some things that can get in the way. 3 come to mind, and I'll go through them as quickly as I can. One is, it could be that something comes up that is a concern about harm or illegality. Gosh, I'm seeing my supervisor verbally abuse someone. I see someone who has firearms in their locker. Someone is there's a substance abuse issue. All these things would make me say, okay, maybe we need to violate at least some of the rules that we set up. Maybe still not identify who said what, but at least say it was from this location or this department. Another possibility is a lot of times employees will, in their comments that they're typing in, they provide almost a lot more information than what they think. And it becomes very obvious to insiders anyway, as to who this is and what they're talking about. So, some of that, I think we have to be careful with employees to make sure they understand, don't divulge more than what you want. And then a third possibility is even with the numeric, the 1 through 5 Likert types, some firms will allow you to slice and dice data. So I tell you what, it was last week. I had an HR person who contacted me and says, we're trying to give reports out to our leaders. One of the reports happens to be something that includes the leader of the group and the group. But then, do I have that right? Actually, no, it's the opposite. It did not include the leader of the group. However, I also wanted to give the CEO the results from all of his, it was a he, his direct reports. So, and it included that same unit. So it was like if all of you were reporting into me, you'd see the scores with me, and then you'd see the scores without me. And it was a small group, and it was horrible because, so anyway, my advice was, no, you can't do that. You can't give two different reports that lets one person's scores be so obvious. So no one tries to do that unless there's reason, but there's always pressure to slice and dice and give more information. And so it's up to you and also your survey vendor to think about these things and to prevent them from happening.
Perfect. Yeah, Nani, I know you had some thoughts too, just providing some additional context as well. It sounds like maybe some of the concern is around other internal colleagues gaining access as well. And that I think types into that slicing and dicing and who and how are we providing information. But anything else, Nani, that you want to add?
No, it disturbs me a little bit that happens. If that's happening, I'm hoping that at Celonis we have a very clear data privacy, kind of compliance mindset that we would not let that happen. I think there's always going to be people who have access to certain data, but I think from my understanding, at least for us, from an engagement score perspective, we can't actually see anonymous data, and we shouldn't. So,
yeah. All right. Perfect. And then let's see, we started in this spot. Paul, you kind of mentioned pulse surveys maybe as a solution. So I'm going to jump to this question, but it's not always feasible to do these massive workplace surveys multiple times throughout the year, especially those of us who are operating with smaller teams right now. So given the rapid pace of change in today's workplace, how do you ensure that our strategies can remain agile and adaptable to meet evolving needs while also still listening to the data that we have available?
Right. Yeah. So I think what's becoming the trend, I think what is the trend, is that we want to have more surveys offered and maybe even shorter surveys. So let me just speak to those two things. Some of you, it may be an effort to have a survey that's even one time per year. I certainly have some clients who will survey once every 2 years or more. I'm not a fan of that. Think about it. You get feedback from your customers instantaneously on these things, right? These smartphones that are connected. So the idea of getting information from your employees in a matter of years, to me, that's not nearly quick enough. So I think the trend is to say, well, can we do things on a quarterly basis? So what I've recommended in a chapter that I did recently, I was saying, imagine if you could survey everybody in a particular quarter of the year, let's say quarter one, just randomly, but in the next quarter two, quarter three, quarter four, maybe you can get, as I said, some feedback. It might be on those progress checks, or maybe it's just say more of, what else is going on and write some things that way. Certainly, there are other forms of feedback that are out there. The idea of sort of, sense taking, there's AI in the background that can take a look at, what's going on through emails and other communication. And I think there's maybe something to be said for that. But let me just say this. The survey is the only method that I'm aware of that lets you start the conversation. So if you just wanted to know, hey, I don't care what I'm thinking, I just want to see what the employees are thinking, great. There are now tools that are at your fingertips that can start to analyze what's going on. But mostly, I think what leaders are looking for is, I want to understand more about this particular aspect. Why are we not, breaking through our barriers for this particular performance goal? Why is this initiative not reaching success at the same pace that we want? Things like that. And of course, that's where employees can say, here's why, right? So I think that, I'm a fan of the survey. I'm a fan of the frequency, but you have to treat it in terms of, what are we trying to discover? let's not overanalyze it. Let's treat it as a dialogue. And that's a word, I don't know if we've used that yet, but it's a dialogue with employees. And the more you're having the dialogue and there are no bad repercussions, right? No one gets fired. There's no, breach of confidentiality, but yet there's good things that are happening. It makes it easier for employees to communicate with you outside of the survey, So I think that's what we really want.
Yeah, I love that as what we hope is the outcome, right? Ani, how about for you? What are some of your thoughts?
I'll just add, for me, we all have very small teams, and so you can get very easily sucked into all this stuff that is out there, the information that's in the survey, and whether it's just engagement survey or any other type of data that is available. I think if you, again, start with, what are the key things that you want to measure, and then tie it to something very specific, because then the data becomes meaningful, right? As I said, you can take a look at this engagement survey and think, oh my God, I can do so much to support this, to support that. Like, here's where we can play a role. But you can end up in a place where you just can't get out of that. So I would, again, look at the data as an input and an out. Like, I look at from both lenses, right? So I look at it as, is it an input to things that I can think about and my team can think about, and what strategies we want to do? But then it's also, it could be an indicator of a behavior that's improving, right? So, for example, recently we used our survey data to show how we've been successful with our leadership development programs, because we looked at the leaders who went through the program and those who did not, and looked at their engagement scores. So you if you focus in on a few key things that you want to look at, and where you can take that data and play around and, get some insights from that, that's always really good, because then you can start to show some impact. So be focused. Not everything is for everything. So, find a couple of key things that are going to be really relevant, and focus on those, and don't feel like you have to kind of boil the ocean with all of that.
Yeah. I have also, we've got some +1s in the chat, driving transition from employee listening to employee dialogue. So we like that word for sure, Paul, right? That it's becoming a conversation. It sounds like, so some good movement there. I also find a lot of interest in this idea of, how do we make L&D more agile, regardless of where we're getting this data, right? I think historically, I have not been a part of organizations that treat L&D as an agile function, right? We plug in our flagship programming and we say that's just going to run itself. And so I think there's some interesting ways too that we can think about incorporating agile principles into the work that we do, so that we can be more flexible as changes arise, whether that's expanding our tech stack so that people have access to more things. It's creating and offering additional programming when possible. What are some ways that we can open up doors for ourselves and kind of pull the levers that we need to as things change? I think is a bigger industry or kind of practitioner problem, but something that stood out to me from that question. All right. I've also just seen some fun, I'm just keeping an eye on the chat, people throwing in their LinkedIn. If anybody wants to stay connected, reach out to other people who are interested in this space. I love seeing that people are sharing their information in the chat. So please feel free to do that if you're comfortable. This is related to a question that popped up in the Q&A, but also we had slated for this panel. For organizations that have limited resources, what are some practical strategies that they can employ to optimize their use of survey data for L&D initiatives? So we've talked a lot about starting small, right? But what are some other practical strategies or things that we can do if we're really limited?
Go ahead, Ani.
So I think similar to the question you had just before, right? So if you have limited resources, you kind of scan the organization for data that does exist, but have a very clear plan on what you are going to measure, because if you don't start there, then it can become a very confusing place that you end up in. So have a very clear idea on, so for us, at least, what we do is we have, our strategy is we measure certain things across all of the programs that we offer. And, and we measure those in a very specific way. But then as we become more focused on the more critical type of initiatives that we're supporting or we're rolling out in the organization from my team's perspective, then we identify some key metrics or measures that we're trying to accomplish. Because the more focused you are, the more the easier it becomes for you to collect and know exactly where you want to get that data and where that data, whether it's, again, survey data or any other type of data, but you can plan for it. I think, I've gotten into that. I've had that situation where I have so much data in front of me, I'm like, oh my God, we could do all of this stuff. And imagine if we were to take this data and understand it differently. But it takes you into a rabbit hole. So I would just keep it focused.
Yeah, focus I think is important. Paul mentioned we were at a conference last week as well, and one of the things that I thought was interesting is that they also talk about how often we're not actioning at the right level, right? So we assume that we have this responsibility at this enterprise level, but the issue is really needs to be resolved at the team level or vice versa. So I think especially when we're operating with limited resources, it's making sure that we understand the scope of the solution. How far does it bubble up? Because if it only bubbles up to the team level, what can you do to optimize the team leaders to kind of manage some of that change at their level versus what is actually bubbling up to your strategic L&D function that you do need to own and to prioritize, and don't overinflate some things that, that don't need to fall within your sphere.
Yeah, and you have to know, how to collect, right? What are all the different inputs it's key, right? If you have, it doesn't always have to be a survey data or something that is very concrete. So for us, we've kind of employed different tiers of listing strategies across the organization, and we use it for different purposes, right? So it's not always about, kind of, you want to create some ability to have conversations. Again, going back to the concept of dialogue. So how do we engage our employees in that conversation, whether it be focus groups or talking to them and meeting them where they're at in terms of, the questions that they may have, and bringing them along on the journey and showing them what we can do to help them. But then there's, at the very senior level, for us, we've put together a learning council that is made up of, I have a one senior, very executive senior level person who sits at that council, and they have the ownership of learning and development and leadership development for their organization. They're the voice of the customer for us, and bring that input, and then also champion, but also bring us data points, right? And so they're giving us from their point of view, what might be. So there are other ways for us to, do this without having to create tons of surveys and tons of evaluations. And, again, do those for the things that are very specific where you do want to show behavior change, but, collect data from different sources and be a little bit more agile about it.
Yeah, I love that. I think sometimes we can lean too heavily on the survey, but there's so many other ways we can gather feedback. Okay, we've got some great questions. We're going to pivot a little bit more to thinking about measuring the effectiveness and impact of L&D programming. I saw some questions pop up in the Q&A, and it's a question that we had slated as well. So how do you recommend, we heard Kirkpatrick mentioned in the chat earlier, but what are some of the recommendations you have on measuring the effectiveness and impact of L&D programs, especially when it comes down to, needing some data to analyze?
Yeah, I can go first if you want, Paul.
That'd be
awesome. I find Kirkpatrick, kind of, this is not a negative comment, it's limiting, right? So when you look at Kirkpatrick, it's very much tied to a specific thing that you're actually doing. But, most learning and development organizations are much bigger than just the one program that they're offering. So if you take a step back and you think about, what are the metrics that you want to have, right? Like that measure effectiveness or efficiency, right, as an organization. And then there could be, because Kirkpatrick model can't be applied to every single workshop or program that you offer. So you want to find the one or two key things that help you measure, specific performance change in the organization around a specific flagship program. So we do that for our leadership programs and maybe one or two key programs. So because otherwise, collecting all of that data and figuring out how to do that is massive. And then, and I know that, we always talk about ROI, we tend to get, kind of wrapped up in that, but, it's not, unless we are starting with a specific business change that we're trying to do, whether, increase our revenue or increase our sales, whatever it may be, ROI becomes, irrelevant. So you have to think, are those going to be the key things that you want to do, and then build your strategy around that. So And then you can think about how I'm going to collect the data for all of this different stuff. But, you have to have a very clear measurement strategy. I find Kirkpatrick limiting because it's just one piece of the formula.
I appreciate what you said about ROI. I think that's the natural next question. If I could survey everybody in this, speaking of surveys, everybody in this webinar, I'd love to be like, how many of you have had an executive come to you and say, what's the ROI of the learning and development function, right? And I think it is a limiting view of the impact of learning and development. We go back to speaking about that conference, but they talked about how, we often are trying to measure behavior change and organizational impact, but it's harder to measure something like, we have fundamentally shifted the way this person thinks about managing people, right? Like that is harder to measure, but equally as powerful. And so how do we make sure that we are capturing those vignettes from a workshop that really stuck with somebody and not minimize those things? So I think that I appreciate you bringing that up. Paul, anything that you'd like to add on measurement? I've seen you kind of all over in the Q&A and in the chat. You're doing a great job of helping us with our limited time, but anything else that you want to add?
No worries. Yeah, no, there were a couple of questions that came up about confidentiality. So I tried to address that a little bit. Regarding your question, Kaylin, on leadership, I guess in my mind, I think about two different sources of information that comes from employees. There's a survey, and then of course there's things like a 360 program. So on the survey, right, there's typically a set of questions that ask about my manager, my supervisor. And so those things are sort of aggregated at the organization level, and then they're broken out by teams. If, as I just said about confidentiality, if the size of the organization allows. I try to remind my clients, hey, supervisors, part of their performance is obviously owned by each of them. I get that. But there's more to it than that. I'm seeing right now survey scores among people leaders are down. And it could be because it may be work-life balance concerns, it may be performance issues, innovation. They're being stretched. And so do I think that means that all of these people leaders suddenly got at an individual level, they're less good than what they were before? No, they're still doing the best that they can. And I think they're just as smart as what they were before. It's the context that they operate in, the support that they're getting from their managers and their leaders and the organization overall. So try to remember that. With 360 feedback, it's kind of the same thing. I think 360s are a little bit more precise in giving feedback to people leaders, but at the end of the day, there's some things that are outside of that leader's control. So as you were saying, Ani, right, if you can, or Kayla, I think you said it, if you can fundamentally change how a leader thinks about what they lead, that's great. And if they're starting to behave differently, that's great. But sometimes bad things still happen and the leader gets blamed. So I'm a little bit trying to side with leaders. Most of them try to do a really good job. I know there are bad bosses out there. I get that. But I think in many cases, these are good people trying to do their best, and they could do better if. And so part of what you have to do as an individual contributor is try to tell them, well, let me see if I can help make it easier for you to give me feedback, easier for you to lead us as a group. So that's, again, collective dialogue, right? That's what I want.
Absolutely. No, that's great. And for people who are, continuing to explore measurement models, of course, Kirkpatrick has been around for 65 years. It's, something that, Hone has rooted some of our measurement in, but there are other frameworks out there, if you're interested beyond the scope of what we're doing here. But Phillips has an ROI model. There's an integrated impact measurement framework that is a mouthful that is built off of Kirkpatrick, but is meant to be more cyclical than hierarchical. So there are certainly some things, if you're interested in measurement, you can certainly reach out to any of us, and I think would be happy to share with you some more information about the frameworks that we're most kind of attached to or interested in for measuring leadership development. We're getting down to the wire here, just about 10 minutes left. I do want to pop into a question that I think is important to all of us, which is how do we balance this kind of dichotomy of, we want to make sure that we are prioritizing the business and organizational priorities, but how do we also then address individual development needs and interests through this process, right? So we have all this aggregate data that's going to inform business strategy, but how do we not forget the individual and what they're aspiring to and what they want to accomplish in our organizations?
Yeah. I'll just say really quickly, I'll repeat something that I talked about. When I look at drivers of engagement, so this is statistical analyses of what's most correlated with engagement. I see that combination of improve us and improve me. So I think for some leaders, I think when it comes to a survey and they're thinking about people, they think these people, all they want is more money and they want benefits and blah, blah, blah. They want to work less. And hey, I like money. Money does buy nice things, right? And so I understand that most of us feel we're probably more valuable than what our salary indicates. No argument. I'm not okay. So you hear me there. But what I do say is I think each of us says, but that's not really what motivates me or demotivates me on a day-to-day basis. It's the people that I'm working with and how I get treated by them. It's the frustrations that never seem to get solved. It's, yeah, we're gonna strive to do this, but then we're cutting budgets and cutting staff, right? So those types of frustrations, the way I think about it is think about the overlap. What's going to motivate me? Again, we are going to get better. And you're listening to me because I have ideas about why I'm getting better. A lot of times people who are known as the complainers, yeah, well, they're complaining because they care. If they didn't care, they wouldn't bother complaining. So how can we start to leverage that and turn that around? Help me understand what improves me and help me understand what improves us. And I think there's a way to make it both work. What do you think, Ani?
A very good point, right? I think you always have to think about the human at the center of it all, right? At the end of the day, it's about our people. We take a little bit of we take that a little bit further. So for us, individual development or, kind of career aspirations have to be tied to that person's role and how that role functions within the organization, and then how that organization then supports the business, right? Results. So if I kind of take it backwards, we look at it more from what are going to be the key skills that we need at the company level that, we need to build those skills. So because then, if we think about, whether we are an organization that goes through change on an ongoing basis, resilience becomes a skill that is critical for success, which then, kind of alleviates some of the needs for that individual, with the frustrations that they may feel, with their work. And then when we start to go deeper and deeper into the functional and the role specific, skills that they need, we can then craft learning and development programs that are going to support very specific skills, again, tied to that person's development, tied to that person's, career progression, make those things available. But, we're taking a very skill-based approach to that, not because at the end of the day, when you work for a company, you're there to build your skill relevant to the role and relevant to the company. And, you may have other personal aspirations, and great if those things are available that you can consume. But, we want to take a very focused approach on what people can do, but still give them the ability to feel that someone is investing in their development and in their career progression at the company.
I think that's great is that we're able to do both in ways that serve each other is kind of what I'm hearing from both of you. We have a few minutes left and a couple questions that came in through the chat that I want to power answer as quickly as we can. So maybe one or both of you, 30-second, great answers to some of these questions. The first one, in your experience, what is the preferred length of a survey? At what point do people start to check out?
People don't really check out until you get over 75 questions, believe it or not. It's a bit of a myth. It's more about what you do with the survey data. If you think it's valuable, you're willing to spend time. Same point. You can answer about 6 questions, those Likert type questions. You can answer about 6 per minute. Having said that, okay, so having given you the facts, a lot of people think it needs to be smaller than, less than 50 items, maybe like 35 items. But empirically, it's not like you get better results or better end sizes or response rates. No, it's about how you use the data, not the length of the survey. Boom.
Ani, anything to add?
I don't have a perspective on that.
All right. Paul crushed it. Our next question from Jenny, a way we're trying to implement relaying training ROI is through scrap learning. So for those of us who might not be familiar with scrap learning in the audience, this is the idea that It's going to represent wasted training time and dollars, the amount of learning content that we're providing that is never going to be used on the job, for example. Any insights on scrap learning, thoughts on that as a measure, any experience that you have? The floor is yours for 30 seconds.
We don't measure because I think it for us, that's an insignificant part of what we do. So we focus our attention on the key things that we can measure, then show ROI on. There are some things that you have to do in the organization where you have to make certain things available. We have a very massive LinkedIn learning library. Do I care what people are going in and doing on a daily basis if they watch a video, whether it's relevant to, kind of the role? Learning is learning, right? It's happening. And I think you have to kind of take that with, with what it is, with the spirit that it's intended for. It's not there to change someone's behavior or to actually build a skill set where they're now selling better or, doing better. They might learn one or two things. Those are not really lasting. That's not a content that you should focus on. You should make it available because it creates access to learning when otherwise it wouldn't be unless you're doing other more meaningful stuff. So take it with that spirit and don't feel like you have to measure ROI on everything. We look at those things more in terms of, what's the per person cost, and whether usage is there, and sometimes if we tie it to other big programs, maybe. But
yeah, perfect. Paul's thumbs up. That's awesome. We got a question for both of you in there in the bottom of the ninth. So last question that I want us to end with is just if there's one thing that you really would think everyone on this webinar today should take away from this discussion, what is that one important thing?
I think for me, the one thing is I'm emphasizing dialogue, right? I'm emphasizing involvement. Make sure that it's not just about getting input from employees and then boxing them out of what to do with it. You want to keep that dialogue going, right? So that's what I mean by that. And as I've said, I think we're way better and way more advanced about getting the opinions, and we're not as good about what do we do with them. So keep it simple. Ani, I like what you said, right? What are some things that we can do if we walked out of this meeting room? Like, I've got my team here, here's our survey scores, we're talking. What are some things we can do when we walk out right now that would have an impact? And we're not done with that. Like, that may be simple, but let's start there. And then let's see if we can progressively get more and more at what the problem is, an iterative approach.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
You stole my keep it simple, Paul, but I'll add, that's okay. You owe me right now. But I'll just add, I think for me, a key thing around any of this, when you want to be effective, again, data is king, but consider all the different inputs that you can have. I find more value in having conversations with my business leaders and business partners. I look at every possible stakeholder and I insert myself in the conversation. And whether I set up a very informal chat or, use my formal channels, I'm always tapping into the business, my HR business partners as well, and trying to make those connections, because the more you do that, the more you're creating credibility because you're listening to them, but you're also getting, again, insights that you might not get just from looking at a survey, a number.
Yeah, I mean, really from both of you, it's go beyond the survey, right?
Yeah.
Do something with it, take an iterative approach, and also make it human. Go talk to people, make connections, make sure that you're aware of what's going on beyond the survey results. So thank you both so much for being here and providing such a really rich and amazing discussion. Thank you, everybody, for being great attendees. We hope to see you at our next webinar as well. This is what's upcoming, why companies fail at internal mobility and how to fix it, with Jeff Diana, Stacy Nordwall, and Rhea Rothels. This panel is going to be discussing how you can spot roadblocks holding your employees back from growing internally, and real world strategies for creating a workplace that encourages growth and advancement. So if you had a great time here, come meet these amazing folks next month, and we will see you there. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.